All righty. Well, thank you for toughing it out to the end. It is not Groundhog Day again. Actually, this is my second presentation. So this is a paper, this is coming from a paper that I'm doing for an independent study that a few colleagues and I did with Dr. Josh Garraway. And if Josh Garraway is watching, which he's probably not, he's probably wondering, well, where is my paper? And this is the last stage of that. So we're going to see how this. Okay, so the title again of my presentation is Fetters of an Evil Age, Angelic Ordinances, Stoicheia to Kosmou, and Works of the Law. Excellent. Okay. So twice Paul references in his letter to the Galatians, which is one of his earliest letters, Paul the Apostle references to the stoicheia to kosmou twice in his letter to the Galatians in 4:3 and 9. You can see here where he says this. Thus also when we were under the
you can move the thing.
Yeah, I should have known this. I'm studying this. When we were underage, we were enslaved under the stoicheia to kosmou. And of course, this is a transliteration of the Greek. And in 4:9, he says, but now having known God, or rather having been known by God, how can you turn again to the weak and beggarly stoicheia, to whom again you desire to be enslaved? And of course, he's writing this to Galatian believers who are being compelled by Jewish teachers who have come in, competitors to Paul's message, and compelling them to be circumcised. Paul's stoicheia remains the subject of much debate among scholars. For example, in Neil Martin's recent lexical analysis of the term in the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, he concluded that stoicheia is, quote, highly dependent on the literary context in which it is situated. In Galatians, stoicheia to kosmou, he continues to say, refers to the fundamental components of pre-Christian living. Recently, in Emma Wasserman's book, Apocalypse's Holy War, she stated that the stoicheia are, quote, components or lesser intermediaries of the cosmos, Gentile gods, cum intermediaries that are now obsolete. In contrast to these views, I will argue that Paul uses the stoicheia in the context of Galatians to describe angelic rulers who enslaved the nations through the law, an idea that has roots in Jewish traditions circulating during the Second Temple period. The credibility of my thesis rests on four major points: the angelic origins of the law, Paul's association of the stoicheia with the law, the reception of Paul's stoicheia in Colossians 2:6-23, and Paul's invective against the works of the law as enslavement to the stoicheia. Midway in his letter to the Galatians, Paul's focus shifts to the stoicheia in Galatians 3:19, highlighting the angelic origins of the law. While arguing that righteousness comes through the Abrahamic promises received by faith rather than obedience to the works of the law, Paul introduces a question about the origin and purpose of the law. After expounding the significance and immutability of the ancient promise to Abraham, Paul asks in Galatians 3:19, why then the law? His answer, it was added because of transgressions until the offspring would come to whom it was promised, having been ordered through angels by the hand of a mediator. So first, the phrase it was added because of transgressions infers that the law was given as a response to transgressions and not so much to provoke or to define sin, as has been often assumed. The law was given because of rebellion and functions to mitigate sinful behavior among a people in whom the Spirit has not yet entered. Second, the law of the nomos was ordered through angels by the hand of a mediator. Paul's view that angels arranged or ordered the law, and of course that the word there in the Greek is diatagais, which it comes from diatasso, which is a term often used in military context in reference to arranging troops or armies. So Paul's view that the angels arranged or ordered the law infers that the law functioned as an expression of angelic authority. The idea shows up in two other passages in the New Testament, namely Acts 7:53 and Hebrews 2:2, and has its origins in Deuteronomy 33:2. The Septuagint version of Deuteronomy 33:2 says, the Lord has come from Sinai, from Sina, with myriads of holy ones at his right hand, angels with him. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Is that right? There we go. Okay. Excellent. The Lord has come from Sina with myriads of holy ones at his right hand, angels with him. The idea here is that when Yahweh descended to give the Torah to Israel, God was accompanied by an angelic army, the holy ones, who participated in the giving of the Torah. I believe this is slide 5, so I don't need to change this. So it's part of a larger discourse concerning the divine council, a council of heavenly beings, all designated as Elohim. In this worldview, God apportioned the nations according to the number of the gods, per Deuteronomy 32:8. When Paul writes of angels ordering the law, he likely had in mind these ancient traditions in which angelic beings were intricately involved in cosmic governance. Supporting this suggestion, Jewish traditions specify that angelic beings were assigned as rulers and guardians over the nation of Israel. And you can see this in the multiple references I have below. Therefore, Yahweh appointed angelic rulers over Israel who exercised their authority via the Torah. It is also possible that Paul's opponents were appealing to angelic authority for the basis of their message, per Galatians 1:8. Thus his warning in the same passage, quote, if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim a gospel to you contrary to what we initially proclaimed to you, let him be accursed. Paul appeared to de-emphasize angelic authority in relation to his gospel message from the very outset. If so, then his concern that the Galatians are submitting to a spiritual authority other than Christ is warranted. Thus, the teacher's ostensible authority, coupled with their promotion of the works of the law among the Galatians, as we'll discuss below, offers a competing message to Paul's gospel and a pathway of return to the stoicheia, namely the authority of angelic rulers. Next, I want to look at Paul's association. Paul's association of the stoicheia with the law in the context of Galatians. Of course, bear in mind that Neil Martin said that if we want to understand this term rightly, we need to understand it in its context. After highlighting the angelic origins of the law, Paul appears to closely associate the angelic rulers with the stoicheia. He does this by drawing a connection between the stoicheia and the law in Galatians 3:19, 4-11. In this section, Paul is working to convince his readers not to receive circumcision according to the instructions of the itinerant Jewish teachers. In Galatians 1-3, he explains that his gospel message came directly to him via revelation of Jesus Christ. So he's claiming that Jesus Christ directly revealed himself to Paul, in contrast to through some angel or intermediary, and has the approval of the Jerusalem apostolate. He shows these things to counter the claims of his theological opponents at Galatia, who seem to be challenging his apostolic authority and imposing the rite of circumcision on the non-Jewish believers in Jesus. After establishing the angelic origins of the law in Galatians 3:19, Paul sets up his foray against the stoicheia in Galatians 3:23-29 with a description of the law's role prior to faith in Christ. Paul describes the law as a, quote, pedagogue, which in the Greco-Roman world described a family slave who assisted in the upbringing of children. What is more, by use of the first person plural pronoun we and our in Galatians 3:23-25, Paul describes the pre-Christ life of him and his audience in terms of spiritual, he describes the pre-Christ life, or the pre-conversion life, if you will, of him and his audience. In terms of spiritual condition, Paul viewed his life in Judaism prior to the gospel as on par with his Galatians audience's former pagan life. In Galatians 4:1-11, Paul repeatedly utilizes the preposition under, hupa, to describe the status of both he and his readers prior to faith in Christ Jesus. We, he says, were under stewards and administrators, verse 2, under the stoicheia, verse 3, and under the law in verse 5. Paul's use of the preposition in these three phrases indicates that he views them in close relation, perhaps even identical. The pedagogue, the law, and the stoicheia are three ways of talking about the same thing, Paul's writing. In Galatians 4:8, Paul writes that formerly you were enslaved to those which by nature are not gods, a likely reference to the pagan deities of their former faith. Paul then goes on to make a rather striking statement. But now having known God, or rather having been known by God, how can you turn again to the weak and beggarly stoicheia, to whom again you desire to be enslaved? Paul first reminds his now ex-pagan followers of Jesus that they were once enslaved to the stoicheia, or quote, those which by nature are not gods, and now they are turning again to the stoicheia. The context of the letter indicates, however, that the Galatians are not turning back to pagan practices per se, but to certain elements of Jewish law. Such things are not pagan. So how can Paul say that the Galatians are turning again to the stoicheia? As an answer, consider the following implications. First, Paul strongly implies that the stoicheia are identical in some sense to the pagan deities to which the Galatians were formerly enslaved. Pagan deities who, in Paul's worldview, were simply members of Yahweh's divine council, angelic beings appointed to enslave the nations. Second, Paul defines the mode of enslavement in Galatians as the observation of Jewish law. This is confirmed by his following statement that the Galatians are observing, quote, days, months, times, and years in Galatians 4:10. Now, the law was given through Yahweh's angels, as ancient Judaism believed, that by inference, to return to the works of the law, however defined, would be to submit to the angelic powers that gave the law. Both Paul and the Galatians were enslaved to the stoicheia prior to their new life in Christ. Paul was enslaved to the law dispensed by angelic rulers, and the Galatian Gentiles were enslaved to the divine rulers described in in Deuteronomy 32:8. Through this comparison, Paul pulls back the veil, as it were, to reveal that the stoicheia were the angelic rulers who guarded Israel via the law all along. From the former pagan perspective of the Galatians, the stoicheia were the pagan deities that they worshipped prior to Christ. But as Paul reveals, the stoicheia were in fact members of the divine council whom Yahweh appointed over the nations, and the angels who assisted Yahweh in ordering the law for Israel. Now that the Messiah has come, the angelic rulers are no longer needed to govern Israel. This is especially so since the law was given to govern a people bereft of moral transformation, that is the Spirit. Now that the Spirit is given to God's people, the angelic dispensation of the law no longer functions the same as it used to. I want to look now at the reception of Paul's stoicheia in Colossians 2:6 through 23. Considering Colossians 2:6 through 23, the use of the phrase ta stoicheia to kosmou triggers a link with the same phrase in Galatians. In Paul's undisputed letters, the stoicheia shows up exclusively in Galatians. Thus, if Paul did not write Colossians, Colossians 2:6 through 23 presents readers with the reception of Paul on the stoicheia. In Colossians 2:8, the author issues an imperative. See that no one will captivate you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the stoicheia to kosmou, not according to Christ. Immediately following, he moves into an explanatory statement, a HUC clause, emphasizing the deity of Christ to reinforce the idea that Christ is above all other heavenly powers, literally the head of every archon and exousia. The next, and this is in Colossians 2:10, the next several verses contain continuative conjunctions that connect what follows to the explanation for the initial imperative. Excuse me. Notably, as in Galatians 3:27, baptism is fronted as the core ritual by which believers are incorporated into Christ and his redemptive work. In Colossians 2:15, the writer asserts in a triumphant tone that the cross was the means whereby God disarmed the rulers and authorities, thus functioning as a rhetorical bookend with his mention of the stoicheia in verse 8. Hence, the Pauline interpreter equated the stoicheia of Colossians 2:8 with the heavenly rulers and authorities. In Colossians 2:16 through 23, the writer establishes a close connection between the stoicheia and the rulers and authorities and the works of the law when he writes, quote, therefore do not let anyone judge you with respect to eating and drinking or with regard to a festival or new moon or Sabbath. All terms related to food and calendar observances drawn from Torah and somewhat reminiscent of Paul's complaint against the Galatians in Galatians 4:10. To conclude, in Colossians 2:20, the Pauline interpreter says that in Christ, believers have died to the ton stoicheia to kosmou. Believers should no longer live as quote, in the world, in kosmou, and submit to them, namely the stoicheia, by observing the aesthetic traditions akin to Jewish purity norms. Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle. Uh-oh. Slide disappeared. That's never good.
Oh, not for me.
I mean,
yours.
yeah, my notes. Here we are. We're back. Okay. The concepts and terms of Colossians 2:6 through 23 are strikingly similar to those in Galatians 3 through 5. Colossians 2, therefore, offers readers an interpretation of the Galatian controversy that supports my view of the stoicheia. The stoicheia are conceptualized as angelic rulers that structure the old cosmos by means of Torah arrangement and administration through law observance. The next thing I want to look at is Paul's invective against the works of the law. Wait a second. Yes, I guess so.
No.
What slide is this? Okay.
You need to go back.
No, I think this is fine. Is this the 9th slide? Is it number 9?
I don't know. I have to look on.
That's okay. We'll just go with this. I'll leave this up
It is
here.
9, yes.
Okay, good. Okay, then I'm where I need to be. I just don't remember this. Paul's invective against the works of the law is enslavement to the stoicheia. So considering the view that the stoicheia are angelic rulers who enslave Israel through the law, and by extension, any nation that submits to the law, prompts a fresh assessment of Paul's invective against the works of the law in Galatians. Throughout Galatians, Paul rails against the works of the law, the ergon nomou, as insufficient to make anyone righteous or grant the Spirit. Rather, Paul argues that as many as depend on the works of the law are under a curse. Just as the nations were enslaved by the angelic rulers through their pagan practices, so those seeking to become Israel through the works of the law are enslaved by those who ordered the law. But for those who have entered into Christ via baptism and received the Spirit, the works of the law cannot add to their status as the people of God. Although debate among scholars over the meaning of the works of the law continues, some defining them as Jewish identity markers and others as rites of a custom, Paul's perspective on the works of the law is not identical to his opponent. Whereas Paul's opponents consider the works of the law to grant a status sufficient to incorporate Gentiles into the people of God, thereby granting a saving righteousness, as it were, Paul considered them the very antithesis of baptism into Christ. For Paul, the reception of the Spirit fulfills the Torah's anticipation that God's people will be circumcised in heart, thus making physical circumcision no longer necessary for inclusion into the people of God. This is per Deuteronomy 36 and Ezekiel 36, 25 to 28. I kind of wish I had some ominous music. Each one of these slides. But, just imagine it. For Paul, an acceptance of circumcision and by extension observance of the whole law meant a pledge of allegiance to the powers behind the law. Paul could say that if you will be circumcised, Christ will be of no benefit to you. This is in Galatians 5:2. Because he believed that submission to the works of the law was an abandonment of Christ for other masters. The dependence for justification, therefore, was not simply on the Jewish status that Torah keeping imparted, but on the angelic rulers who ordained the law and imparted said status. It was an essential denial of the exclusivity of Christ as the one who justifies and an embrace of a syncretistic ideology with claims of angelic authority. Stop it. The argument that Gentile believers must become Jews was merely a smokescreen for the angelic powers truly at work in the controversy, at least from Paul's perspective. Powers from which Paul believed declared believers to be free, whereas Paul's Jewish opponents seemed to consider Jesus a new component in the larger and older system already set in place, a system into which they were compelling the Galatians to enter via circumcision. Paul was claiming that Jesus was the new system to which the older system has given way. Whereas Paul's Jewish opponents understood works of the law, such as circumcision, to be a means for incorporating Gentile believers into Israel and thus attaining full status among the people of God, Paul understood the embrace of the works of the law as enslavement to the angelic rulers of the old age. More importantly, contrary to the claims of the Galatian teachers, Paul did not believe that the Gentile believers would become Jews by receiving circumcision. Paul's view was far more radical than that. By receiving circumcision, the Spirit indwelt believers would not become Jews. They would in fact become Gentiles again. They would be cut off from Christ. Beneath the attractive veneer of the teacher's doctrines was a strong deception that taking on the works of the law would bring the Galatians a Jewish status, when in fact it would force a reversion into enslavement to the stoicheia under which they formerly lived. So the works of the law, therefore, would function as fetters, binding the Gentile believers to their present evil age, from which Christ delivered them by giving himself for their sins, per Galatians 1:4. In conclusion, in Paul's view, then, the stoicheia are neither the fundamental components of pre-Christian living, nor simply referring to Gentile gods per se, but angelic rulers who enslave the nations through the law. Paul sharply equates enslavement to the stoicheia with acceptance of the works of the law, a law which was ordered by angels. Consequently, the works of the law function as fetters by which people are enslaved to those which by nature are not gods. And that is the end. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
That was very interesting to me. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I know nothing from nothing about what's going on here. So it's an interesting aperture to get. What struck me as completely lay person is the concept of enslavement, right? Is this a common rhetorical gambit for Paul, like as a conceptual device, a metaphor? That,
Yeah.
Because to me, it's not the concept of slavery that filters down from the tradition from which Paul comes out of, if you see what I'm saying.
No, that's a great question. Yeah, so the question is the concept of enslavement, as Paul uses it here, something that he uses elsewhere, or and how does that characterize from him? Yeah, so he refers to himself as a doulos, as in the Greek term for slave, in reference to Christ. So Paul thinks in Romans and in Galatians, or in the undisputed letters, which were 7 altogether, Paul considers that everyone is in some form or another enslaved to someone, right? Either they're enslaved to the forces of the world, or the stoicheia, or to Christ. And of course, I think the idea, or at least what fills that idea for Paul, is probably slavery as understood in the Greco-Roman context, perhaps debt slavery, or political slavery, or something like that. I mean, there's different ways in which slavery was implemented in the ancient world. Either way, it was an admission that one's life is not their own, right? It's probably the idea of property is involved. And so, so he does use that terminology. He uses that metaphor a lot in reference to himself. Even he says he himself is a slave to Jesus. So, yeah.
Thank you for the very compelling argument. I guess I'm trying to think through what you're actually arguing. In terms of, because first of all, the work of Galatians stands alone as a particularly polemical work on Paul's, with, in my reading, a very particular argument about a very particular instance, the question of circumcision of Gentiles. So my question is, are you arguing for the correct reading of Paul's use of the law in that rhetorical argument, or are you arguing for what's Paul's view of the law?
Okay, so the question was, correct me if I state this wrong. Am I arguing for Paul's view of the law in the argument, or am I arguing for Paul's, I guess, this particular way in which he's polemically going after his opponents and their use of the law? Or is,
Are you arguing for a particular use of his view of the law
Yeah.
in this argument?
Yeah.
Or are you making a broader case
mhm.
for what Paul's general view of the law was?
Yeah, no, so I'm not making a broader case for what Paul's general view of the law was. I'm making a case that this, in a lot of ways, was an ad hoc argument, especially his use of the term stoicheia. Because the term, if you know, outside of Galatians in Greek literature, it has a lot of diverse usages. In this case, I think he's using it as terms that are familiar to his audience, being Greeks, in a way to sort of subvert their understanding of what's actually going on. I don't think Paul would be opposed to the law in principle or in and of itself, but he's opposed to its application in this context in an effort to tell Gentiles that they need to do something to add to their status or to complete the full status of becoming a Jew or an Israelite. I think in other places, like in Romans, he says the law is holy and good and righteous and just. So I think he finds that the law is useful in some places. I don't think he would be opposed to, say, a Jew getting circumcised because he himself was a Jew. I think the point is here, he's opposed to Gentiles being told, if you want to be saved, if you want to be righteous, the kind of righteousness that Abraham had, you need to be circumcised. When he's saying, no, that's not the case at all. You just need the Spirit. You need faith in Jesus. And if you do this, then what you're actually doing is subjecting yourself to the powers that order the law, and i.e. angelic powers, the old order, and what he would consider subordinate powers to Christ, who's been exalted above those powers. So yeah, it's a particular way in which he's discussing the law. In a lot of ways, it's ad hoc, and I don't think it addresses his whole view of the law. If that makes sense. Yes.
So you will recall that instances
I know
in Midrash, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
No intermediaries.
Lo al yedei malach, velo al yedei shaliach. Several of those have to do with, you know, who is delivering this law?
Yeah.
And one certainly in the Passover Gada, who is it who's actually delivering Israel, right?
Yeah.
And we said, well, it can be logos theology, it can be bitheism, but to some extent, it can also be something along these lines. Not that it's necessarily in conversation with Paul, because what Paul is talking about here, allegiance to angelic rulers, is a much broader background.
Yeah.
Certainly in this contemporary world. You know, I think it does address that among other possibilities in that respect.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. As I was writing this, I was thinking about those texts we looked at. And how this potentially shaped the early Christian understanding of the relationship of the law with Gentiles. Did I see someone else have their hand up? Yeah.
What kind of happened was you know, where he, I think Galatians 4:8, which by nature are no gods, just the negative tails there. But that really reminds me, courtesy of Robert Alter, he translates, it's kind of a homonym of Elohim, LLE, or something like that in Psalm 95 and 6 as ungods. You know, it's kind of the same sort of idea, and probably most English translations just translate that idols, some worthlessness or something. But I think he's really closer to the Hebrew there.
Yeah, that's part of when I talk about Deuteronomy 32:8 and in the Hebrew text, and in the Greek I think literally translates that like it's like lo Elohim or something like that, or I don't remember the exact words, but it's essentially non-gods. Yeah, would be a literal. Yeah, so I think that's in the back. That's part of Paul, at least Paul's echoing that to some degree, or it's a part of his thinking, part of the worldview that he's bringing to. Yeah. Okay, looks like that's it. Well, thank you again for attending.